This is a small EDC blade from Ozark Traditional Knifeworks. It's made from an extremely high carbide steel, and it's given a very high hardness in the heat treatment. This is a small peasant blade from Svord. It's made out of bandsaw steel, very low carbide. In fact, bandsaw steels typically have nickel in them to prevent carbide precipitation during the quench, because you're trying to get very high toughness. And this is also left at a moderate hardness, about the mid-50s. Now, I do some relatively controlled comparisons of edge retention, cutting ability on things like cardboard, natural ropes, some other things. But it's interesting and a bit fun every now and again to sort of relax the controls and sort of look at the question, well, if you didn't have any of that, if you weren't doing very precise measurements, could you actually see differences in the steels? Okay, fine. If you go to cardboard and you do very specific edge length cuts with a very specific angle, very specific edge finish, control the force, control the speed, do very precise measurements on sharpness, maybe you can see a difference. What about if you don't do any of that? What about if you just take some material in the two knives and just sort of cut it up? Are the differences large enough to be obvious? And that's an interesting question. And the reason that it's an interesting question is that's what the majority of people do. The majority of people, when they're using knives, don't sit down and say, okay, I'm going to do 575 cuts through 1/8 inch ridge corrugated cardboard and check my edge retention. It's not what most people do. So even though you can see differences that way, that answer mightn't be to the question that's relevant. So as I do some sharpening and minor edge repair and some other things for friends and family, and they know I do these sort of types of experiments, I often get very interesting gifts from them. I'll get a bag and it could contain some dirty old polypropylene rope, or last one I got a few days ago after I sharpened up some kitchen knives, I got a couple of old garden hoses that weren't being used anymore. Now, I'd never cut up a significant amount of garden hose. I had no idea what it was going to do to the knife edge. I didn't expect it was going to do very much. It's basically just rubber and a bit of plastic. But do a little check. So using the EDC blade, I made 100 slices. It's not very difficult to cut up. And both these blades have very low edge angles. They're less than 10 degrees per side, and they have a very fine micro bevel set with the stone with one of the silliest knife names I've ever seen, medium extra fine DMT diamond plate. It easily 100 slices through the garden hose and did next to nothing to the blade. Couldn't really see much of a difference in terms of how it was cutting through the hose. I did a quick couple of checks on paper when it was done, no big difference. Went inside, cut up a few apples, no significant difference I could see in the blade. Didn't really make much effect on it. Interestingly enough, I then took the Svord small peasant. Almost immediately after making a few cuts, I could notice the cutting got much harder. Completed the 100 cuts, looked at it, and sure enough, a section of the edge about 1 centimeter long had completely collapsed. And you'll even see on video where I take the blade and I'm rubbing it across my finger, it's completely blunt by this point. The edge is completely smashed off. That's where a lot of people then jump in and say, oh yeah, well, you know, low quality steel, it doesn't have very many carbides, it's relatively soft. That could be. That could possibly be true. That may be the reason. I went in and resharpened it. Did it a couple more times with the Svord, and this is the edge right after one of the runs. Made no difference to the edge whatsoever. It held up just as good as the EDC blade, meaning that it never did anything to it. Making 100 cuts through garden hose had no effect on either blade. Now, that leaves you with, well, why did it collapse in the first time? One of the biggest issues, one of the biggest problems when you're trying to compare blades and you relax all the controls and you let a lot of random factors come in, is that you can often see in your final result one random factor. And after I looked at the garden hose and I collected up and swept up all the little pieces, and I started looking at them, some of the pieces were very dirty on the inside, very full of gravel. So most likely what happened, all that happened, is when I was cutting with the Svord, I probably hit a small piece of rock or dirt and graded it along the edge, because a small piece of rock trapped between the edge and the cut and just graded along, and that peeled the edge right off. Because it never happened in the next 2 times I repeated another 200 cuts. Made no significant difference on the edge. And that reason, how you can see such dramatic differences, where it went from going completely blunt in one trial and having no edge retention, just gone within the first few cuts, no edge retention, almost blunted completely to zero, so blunt that you can't even measure the sharpness anymore, to doing 2 more trials that do nothing, have no effect on the edge whatsoever, is because when you throw away the controls and you just do normal random type work, you often just see the results of those random type influences. And that's one of the reasons why you can see such dramatic polarization in the knife industry. You can ask one person about, hey, how would you describe this steel? And you ask another person, how would you describe this steel? And you get 2 completely different perspectives, but the steel is the same. It doesn't change properties dramatically. And what's really interesting, and you can see this very easily on many forms, people's perception of a steel changes how they influence what they see. Now just imagine if instead of the Svord hitting that piece of grit and compacting and rolling the edge, imagine if it was this knife. Then all of a sudden I would have a Svord that did 100 cuts on this old piece of tube. And this very expensive knife did like 5 and went immediately blunt. Imagine if I posted that up. Imagine the responses that I would get. A bunch of people would immediately say, well, you know, you probably accidentally hit something, blah, 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 you should repeat it again. Excellent advice. But if I had just posted up, well, you know, I did this, was absolutely perfect, made 100 cuts, went in, filleted a bunch of salmon, no issues. Did this, made 5 cuts, the edge rolled, couldn't even peel an apple. What do you expect? Cheap steel, cheap hardening, it's only a production knife. It's made for people who can't afford good knives. Just take a look at those type of comments. Just take a look at when people are replying and talking about work, how often they make the same sort of comments, how often they have the exact same perspective. You will tend to see that people respond to descriptions about so-called high-performance steels in custom knives very differently than people who are doing the same work and getting the same results with cheap knives. If there's a problem with a cheap knife, oh, it's because it's a cheap knife. If there's a problem with a very high-end, a very expensive, very custom knife, oh, well, maybe you did something wrong. It was your fault. It was abusive. It was whatever, whatever, whatever. It's the same work. It's the same results. Completely different conclusion. Completely different reply. One thing that I will say about this, as a note on the end, this has to be one of, if not, the very best Kydex sheets that I've ever handled. One of the things that I didn't like about Kydex, up until very recently, many things that I don't like about it, is that it's very difficult to get a balance of properties on the sheath. I've seen lots of sheets that were so tight the security was excellent. I've seen lots of sheets that was very easy to move the knife in and out of. But generally they come at the expense of something else. You get a sheath that holds a knife very well, it becomes impossible to draw the knife out of. You get a sheath that is very easy for the knife to move in and out of, but it's rattly, it moves around. This has no rattle, it makes no noise. It's also very secure. This is not going anywhere. I'd be completely comfortable wearing this as a neck knife. Yet it has no great big thumb ramp, but it's extremely trivial to take this knife out. And it's very easy to push that knife in, but yet it's completely secure. It goes in completely smooth. It's an outstanding piece of Kydex work. And if this had to been the very first Kydex sheet that I ever used, my perspective on Kydex might be a bit different than it actually is. I still don't like it for cold weather work, and it also has some problems in extremely high heat. Leather is much better in both respects, but this is one of the few Kydex sheets I've seen which has excellent security and just perfect ease of use. I would like to see people not just simply defaulting to those snaps though, and actually look at some kind of real integral holding system for the knife, especially when you're paying the kind of money to get this kind of knife.